So there are restrictions on radical equations and radical expressions. And there's what we consider what would be an inside restriction and an outside restriction. Okay, so the inside restriction is that the inside of the radical cannot be negative. So remember, we cannot square root negative values. So when you have an expression like this, 2x plus 1, we have to make sure that 2x plus 1 must be bigger than or equal to 0. It has to be positive. If that's the case, then that means that the 2x must be greater than or equal to negative 1, and then the restriction becomes the x must be greater than or equal to negative 1/2. Okay, so this is my restriction. I can only use x values that are bigger than negative 1/2, because if I use, for example, negative 1, we end up with a negative inside the square root, so that x being negative 1 makes this expression unusable, okay, because of the negative inside the square root. So there's this inside restriction that happens because of the nature of the square root. Okay, now here we don't have to worry about the outside restriction, because not really, this is just an expression, not equal to anything, but we still cannot square root the inside negative. Okay, so that means that the x minus 4 must be bigger than 0. That means that in order for that to happen, the restriction then becomes x must be greater than or equal to 4. Okay, if x is 3, we're going to end up with a negative. Okay, and that won't work. So this is our restriction. X must be greater than 4. And these are considered inside restrictions because they're on the inside. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight that. So those are my inside restrictions. Okay, so we have the same thing here. This has to be an inside restriction. Okay, I have an inside restriction here. That inside must be greater than 0. So we can solve for that if you want. You can say that 2x minus 5 must be greater than or equal to 0. It can be 0 because we can square root 0. Solving for x, we get x must be greater than or equal to, well, we're going to add 5 to both sides and divide both sides by 2 to solve for x. So there's my inside restriction. X must be bigger than positive 2.5. Okay, because if it's smaller than 2.5, okay, for example 1, we're going to end up with a negative inside the square root. So that's the most important part, is making sure you understand the inside restriction. Now I'm going to add a little bit to this and say that there's also an outside restriction, because this square root cannot equal negative. Okay, so remember that square root is a principal square root, meaning that when we do the square root, we always get a positive value. So this expression here can't be negative. Okay, so I'm going to say that negative 3x plus 5 must also be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, we cannot have values that are of x that would make this smaller than 0, because then that means that we're going to square root and get a negative. Not possible. So there's my outside restriction. So I'm just going to label this my outside. Okay. Okay, so this is my outside restriction. So then I solve for this. I'm going to get negative 3x is greater than or equal to negative 5. Remember, if I solve this inequality, if I divide by negative, I have to flip the sign. Okay, and so there's my outside restriction. And those two together then represent my full restriction. Okay, so it's important that we understand, first of all, the inside restriction is the most important. But there's also an outside restriction, meaning that the outside of the square root cannot equal negative. Okay, so when we square root, remember it's a principal square root, and it can't be negative.